Welcome to ADRA Insider, where we share insights into ADRA's work and the people behind the work that we do. Today's episode is in recognition of World Environment Day, which is on June 5th. And as my guest, today I have Avish Raj, who is the Associate Director for Programs at ADRA Canada. Welcome, Avish. Thank you so much for joining us on our ADRA Insider podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you here because I'm very excited about what you're going to share with us today. The topic is climate change, and just from what I've watched with you over the years, I know this is something you care a lot about personally, and especially how it pertains to ADRA's work. So welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Heather, and I count it as a privilege to be talking to you on this ADRA Insider.
I'm wondering a little bit about you, who you are, where you come from, how you ended up at ADRA. If you could fill us in a little bit about who Avish is, that would be really great.
I am an Indian. I am married, and I have three beautiful daughters. And I did my college in Pune, in a very well-known college then, and now it's an university called as Spicer Adventist University. I did my bachelor's in theology, and then I did my master's in religion from Andrews University's extension program in Spicer. And I started my ADRA work as a field assistant and then moved as an M&E person. And then I enjoyed working with ADRA Thailand for over 3 years before I joined ADRA Canada in 2015.
Okay, so let's just dive right in, I think. Tell us about climate change. How would you explain that in layman's terms? There's a lot of science behind it. For some people, it feels like a highly political term as well. But just neutral layman's terms, how would you explain what climate change is?
There are two keywords I would want us to understand. There has been a long-term shifts in temperatures that you see. And we also see that there is shift in the weather patterns as well. And I don't have to even justify that because you would see that in everyday news. People are seeing this. People are witnessing to these drastic shift in weather patterns. So when we say climate change, we are actually saying that there is a shift in the temperatures and there is a shift in weather patterns. And this is alluded to natural phenomena, like, for example, sun flares. It's a natural cause. However, the scientists have been tracking and recording these changes, especially in 1800s onwards. So when they look at what is transpiring compared to pre-industrial and post-industrial, they're seeing significant shift, and it has been tied to human beings, unfortunately.
So it's cumulative over time, right? Is what I'm hearing you say, like actions of industries, actions of individuals and systems over time have been accelerating this shift that's happening. So where does that place us today? You know, you said they started measuring in the 1800s. That was a good time ago. Now we're almost a quarter of the way through the 21st century. Where are we today in this shift, and what can we expect to see coming down the road?
What we are seeing right now, the world governments are maintaining the status quo, which means they're not doing much about being more energy efficient. They're not doing much about moving to alternate energy like solar, wind. If they continue to maintain the status quo, if there is a continued demand for energy, which is being actually fueled by coal, oil, gas, and all of that, what we are seeing is actually a rise in temperature by 2100. It would increase by 3.6 degrees Celsius. Now, that simply means that we would be putting into the atmosphere, into our environment, close to 90 to 100 gigatons of carbon emission in the atmosphere, which is what will drive this shift and drastic increase in the Celsius by 3.6. And if you want to convert that into Fahrenheit, it would be 6.5 Fahrenheit. So basically, what this means is not a good news for mankind. It it is actually an existential threat, I would say, if this continues. According to the science, they say if this continues with the 3.6 as a trajectory, we would see Arctic sea ice is gone in 2 out of every 3 summers. 50% of insect species lose 50% of their habitat range. And you would also see droughts becoming 11 months longer. And Canada is no new to fires, what we saw in McMurray and some other parts of BC. So these things are going to get intensified. What this basically means is loss to human life, loss to human property, damage to economy. So the science says the next 10 years is critical, according to the IPCC reports. It's very clear that governments around the world, people, nations need to come together to find a solution to this evolving crisis that we're seeing day to day.
It feels enormous. Like, what could one single person do to help avert the disasters or to help slow the climate change? Like, I'm not in the government, I'm not at the United Nations, but what can I do? Is there anything I can do as an individual? Like, what's my responsibility here?
At a personal level, we need to start asking, okay, then what should I do? For instance, I just want to pose this question to you. If you were driving your car from your home to office, and you realize that there are 2 other friends in the same locality going to the office, would it be ideal all of you together travel in one car as opposed to 3 cars driving to the same location while there is enough of space still in your cars? Imagine yourself in a shower. How much of water do you use in the shower? Sometimes personally, I feel guilty. Wow, am I taking 15 minutes, 20 minutes? How much of time is really required for me to actually conserve water? Sometimes we take these small things as a luxury and take it as granted, and not pay attention to it. Look at the food. How much of food do we waste? Look at our food habits. For instance, how much of resources does it take to eat meat as opposed to how much of resources would it take to actually for a plant to grow? The science says that the resources needed to actually the animal to grow, it's far, far greater than what a plant would require. So if you shift from animal diet to plant diet, you're actually alleviating a lot of stress on the nature. There are many little things that you could do. You could also be an advocate. What you know, you can share with others. Sometimes the word of mouth is more powerful than the research document and the thesis and so on and so forth. So the word of mouth, if you're convinced others, you have better chances that you can convince others. What about your church? How many of your church members are really paying attention to the climate change? How could one at a personal level contextualize this climate change to the pastors, to the church leaders? What language do we use with them? Do we use like mitigation, adaptation, climate change? What about using the word like caring for the environment? And if you look at the Seventh-day Adventist churches' doctrinal belief statements, we have clearly articulated belief statements, and one of which is focusing on stewardship. Can we focus on that as opposed to saying climate change and all of this? So there's so much that we can do at a personal level, and the list is endless. So I would encourage everyone to just step out of this and reflect and see how you can become the catalyst in sharing this imminent crisis that is evolving.
For sure. Even if something feels enormous and like your individual actions can't turn the tide, I believe that we still have a responsibility to do what is before us to do. And thank you for sharing those very practical suggestions on how we can do that. It's something to think about, and also to explore other ways that we can contribute to stemming the tide of climate change. What are some of the other impacts that climate change is having on people that we aren't feeling, but that are certainly happening?
Right. One other example that I can give you, imagine people who are having farms along the riverbed.
Mm-hmm.
Their whole livelihood depends on those farms. And now, because of the flooding that takes place, all of that farm is now inundated with water.
Mm-hmm.
Now, hundreds of households, their food is dependent on that farm. Their children's school fees would come from selling those yields. The houses they lived in, because of this flooding, it's gone in an instant.
Mm-hmm.
So their livelihoods is gone. They get into negative coping strategies. Now they don't have money. What would they do? They start borrowing. In some context, they start begging. In some context, they would send their children as human slaves, flesh trade, people eating less meals. If they're used to eat 3 meals, because now that they don't have food, they would just have 1 meal a day.
Mm-hmm.
Mothers, lactating mothers, they would need nutritious food to produce good milk for their less than 5-year-olds, but they can't afford it because of this loss and damage. So the list goes on with the challenges and troubles. So you've got famines, you've got flooding, you've got sea level rising, and it has its own consequences. The acidification of the sea as well because of climate change.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the point I was really trying to drive home, and I think you did it, is it's not just 50% of insects lose 50% of their habitat. It's not just we no longer have Arctic ice. We're talking about mothers, fathers, children whose lives are directly and negatively impacted by this right now. And it will only continue to get worse if we don't take action.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit now about what is ADRA doing to not only help these people who have already suffered the effects, but is ADRA doing anything to make them stronger, or to maybe locally try to turn the tide somehow? What is ADRA doing exactly when it comes to climate change?
Right. So my answer here would be perhaps twofold, looking at climate change response from ADRA network as a global strategy, and also looking at how ADRA Canada fits into that strategy and what steps have we already taken and would be taking going forward. What has happened of lately, I would say in the last 1 year, while the pandemic was on, a group of interested people from different supporting ADRA offices and implementing offices came together, and also the regional offices came together to try and grapple on what can ADRA do in the realm of climate change. There are 3 key areas what ADRA would be focusing on. One is on the leadership, the second one is on the programming, the third one is on the advocacy. Under the leadership, the goal there, the objective there is that by 2027, 100 country offices will have implemented green accountability plan, which simply means we understand how much of carbon we are emitting, we would measure it, and we will know how to reduce it. So we are accountable. We should be accountable for how much of carbon you emit. So that's the goal. Number 2, under programming, under that pillar, by 2027, 100 country offices have integrated nature-based solutions in all the development and humanitarian programming. Now, this word might be a little bit more technical, nature-based solution. It simply means you have a challenge which is caused by climate variability. Let us say in a coastal area, because of high sea level rise, the water just comes in on land and floods. Now, when we say nature-based solutions, so we are trying to identify a solution which is derived in the nature, which
Mm-hmm.
means what about planting mangrove trees? Mangrove is nature. So you're
Mm-hmm.
not inventing a mechanical machines to do that piece of work, but you're identifying a solution which is there in the nature because mangroves have higher capacity to build that natural barricade that can,
Mm-hmm.
withstand the water getting into the inland.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of thing. So the idea is that 100 country offices would have identified nature-based solutions that could be integrated within their existing programming. And the last one is on the advocacy piece. We are saying by 2027, 100 country offices will have coordinated, sustained, and influential climate justice and advocacy campaign.
Hmm.
Now, these are bigger words: climate justice and advocacy campaign. To break that down, simply means you are voicing out against the injustice caused by all that we see, caused by the climate change related issues and challenges. There are
Mm-hmm.
people suffering, so we are voicing out together with coordinated, approach, lobby with the government, saying that people need their justice.
Mm-hmm.
Their rights needs to be heard because they have been impacted by climate change. So that sort of thing. So these are three key pillars at the global ADRA level, but at the ADRA Canada level, we also have a climate change working group under CFGB, which I'm also part of, along with my good colleague Salil Bhattarai. We're also part of C4D, which is Climate Change Coalition, a platform where many NGO civil society organizations are part of it in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
We are part of that to understand, learn, and share what's happening with the climate change. We're also trying to now put in place the climate change policy. I believe this policy is yet to be approved by the board, which basically says that any programming at the operational level, at the project level, international or national, we will try and sensitize ourselves, our teams, to understand what climate change is, how it is impacting our programming, and what could we do to adapt, to make changes in our systems and practices so that
Mm-hmm.
we become accountable, so
Mm-hmm.
that we don't put people in the community at harm. So that sort of thing will be dealt within this policy, and that gives us a mandate to move forward and implement those things. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and apart from that, we're doing a little bit of small sensitizations and trainings, um, within our smaller teams with colleagues one on one to understand what climate change is.
I just wanted to back up a little bit to the notion of climate justice. It's a very interesting phrase, putting those two terms together. And as I was thinking about what you've shared so far about how
Mm-hmm.
climate change is impacting small farmers, impacting
Mm-hmm.
families whose livelihoods depend directly on the
Mm-hmm.
seasons and rainfalls and things, it's very sobering to think that my lifestyle, like you said, which I take for granted, um, combined with industrial nations' lifestyles and systems, is negatively impacting these people who don't have the same resilience to withstand those shocks as I have. And is that what you mean? Is that kind of the direction of what climate justice is saying? Is like these people who are suffering the most from the change are contributing the least to the drivers of that change? And is it just kind of people
Exactly. Yes.
standing up
What you're
and saying,
seeing,
this is me. This is my responsibility. I need to do something about this. Is that the notion behind climate justice?
yes, that is
Mm-hmm.
part of the notion. And the other aspects of that is actually pushing the donors and the governments to meet their own commitments. Imagine you have this a very good looking strategy and good looking action plan. In the end, if you do not have resources, how could you even address those challenges?
Mm-hmm.
So one way is to push the governments, ask them the right questions, sensitize them, bring them into dialogue, push them to release more resources so that they can meet these challenges. Like you were mentioning, a lot of people who have been affected by climate change are the least contributed to those things.
Can you share a couple examples of what ADRA is doing to address climate change?
So we saw many offices are already doing climate change related activity as a cross-cutting issue,
Mm-hmm.
which means that, let us say, their main focus is education, but then climate change is a small piece that
Mm-hmm.
is being addressed. For instance, maybe educating people on climate change, maybe asking the students to plant trees because
Mm-hmm.
the trees and plants absorb carbon dioxide and they store deep down in the ground. It's a natural process. Perhaps teaching them how to save water as a component, water
Mm-hmm.
harvest. So that sort of thing. So many offices were doing a sort of a cross-cutting type of activity, but we saw few offices who focused heavily on climate change action. The whole project is designed around that.
Mm-hmm.
Around that, for instance, what ADRA Mozambique did, they
Mm-hmm.
specifically did an assessment in the Bay Area in Maputo region, understood the challenges along the Bay Area, tried to work with the uh, um, fishery department and the fishermen and women there, and people who were heavily dependent on the natural resources like forest and forest products and wood, all of that. So helping them to identify alternate livelihood activities so that they
Mm-hmm.
don't use the resources from these parks, national parks or forests. Because if they cut down the forest, the repercussions of that is increased climate variability in the
Mm-hmm.
immediate or long term. So helping them to meet their livelihood, but then also trying to protect the national parks, protect the forest,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing. Waste management is also a key component in most
Mm-hmm.
of our programming, especially the programming which is linked with WASH, water and sanitation,
Mm-hmm.
wherein people are taught how to collect the waste, how to manage it, how to dispose it, how to recycle it.
Mm-hmm.
So, in cases where the plastics are used, sensitizing the community in a sense that they could use those plastic products for the domestic purpose, for example, to collect the water or to grow plant, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to just throwing them in the garbage.
Mm-hmm.
Another very interesting project where ADRA, through the community in Mandera, which is the northernmost part of Kenya, it's very interesting to see how we are working with the community to rehabilitate degraded land.
Mm.
That's again a nature-based solution. What we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do is, in order to help households to meet their livelihood needs, plus to help their animals to have healthy, nutritious food. We started with an approach called as farmers managed natural regeneration process, wherein in agreement with the communities, they start fencing the land so that that land is protected from overgrazing or haphazard grazing by animals. And
Mm-hmm.
then that land, for the first time, what they would do is they would broadcast a specific type of grass, wherein it allows that particular land which is untouched, then allows the seeds to grow, and they would have plantation in abundance
Mm-hmm.
for their animals through a proper grazing mechanism, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to sending their animals here and there and start eating all those things. And when everything is over, they start moving beyond those lines into different communities, causing more problems with the other communities and causing some conflict. Towards the end of the project, I believe they had rehabilitated close to 7 or 8,000 acres of land. And also, when this grass is no longer green, when they dry up, they turn this into hay and fodder for these
Mm-hmm.
animals to be fed when there is no rain. And as a result of that excess hay that they have, They would also sell it in the market to make more money. This was one of our most successful projects. When we left them after 10 years, the community is more resilient because they have new practices. There were women groups formed who would save money among themselves. There were animal health workers. They learned how to care for their animal and treat them.
Mm,
We also helped a few farmers to start their own small gardens that they can grow
mm,
vegetables. And we also worked with them in constructing about 4 or 5 farm ponds where the rainwater is collected in that farm ponds and being used by the farms which are close by, so that
mm-hmm.
year round they are producing something or the other, so that year round they have vegetables in the community. They always felt that vegetables are just for the animals and not for people in
Mm-hmm.
Mandera community. And now they appreciate what vegetables bring to their households and the health that is associated with it.
The ripple effect from that, barren land is now productive. Fathers and sons don't have to migrate far from the women and children, leaving them behind to make shift as they can. Their animals are healthier, producing more, fetching higher prices. They can feed them year round. They're growing their own vegetables, having the health benefits of that in their own bodies that they share through their stories. Women are owning their own businesses now, saving money, sending their children, their nieces and nephews, their neighbors' kids to school, even to university in some stories. It's just, that project for me is amazing. It helps the environment and it helps the people. And it just keeps going from there. The ripple effect just keeps going. It's truly exciting, that one. So in the past, the phrase that we heard a lot was global warming. And in our discussion so far, I haven't heard you mention that. You keep referring to climate change. So I was wondering if global warming is just not something we say anymore, or is climate change just more in vogue, or is there an actual difference between the understanding of those two terms?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the way I look at these two terms is just like a cause and consequence.
Mm,
Um, um, Climate change is a result of global warming.
mm-hmm,
Um, when we say global warming, what it simply means is that because of the pollution, because of the carbon emission that is being created as a result of burning the dirty fuel like coal, petrol, gas, all of that emission is just getting congested in our atmosphere.
mm, mm-hmm,
The natural process is when the heat hits, the light hits, the warmth hits the earth, it ripples back. Something remains what is healthy for us, but
mm-hmm,
some of it has to go back. Right now, 2022, there is about 60 gigaton of carbon emission, which is congested in this
mm,
atmosphere. So what's happening when the heat comes down and hits the earth, it is getting trapped. Some of it is getting trapped because of this congestion of emission. So when it gets trapped and there's no place for it to escape completely, what happens is thawing of the earth, which is what we
mm-hmm,
call as global warming,
mm-hmm,
because that heat is being now, say, accumulated because it's not escaping out of
mm-hmm,
the natural process. As a result of this global warming, a thawing of the earth, there is climate variability.
mm-hmm.
There is change in the patterns of temperatures, weather. So they are interconnected, but global warming, I would say it has as a cause, and the
Mm-hmm.
consequences is the
Climate.
change in the climate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. That helps a lot. I'm just thinking it's too bad there isn't a Tony Stark in real life from Iron Man, because I'm sure he would develop this device that would eject the excess heat back into space. But since he is
Mm.
highly fictitious, it brings us back to the reality that we each have a responsibility as
Well,
individuals and as countries.
we should not lose hope. There is in the development of, let us say, machines, which is now in the pilot phases. It's called as carbon capture and storage. These machines would actually capture the carbon emissions in the air and transport it deep down under the earth where it has been trapped under the rocks. So that way you're actually reducing the carbon emission. But again, on the other end, people would take a nature-based solution, which means they would enrich the soil by following conservation agriculture, like minimum tillage, avoiding using chemicals and cover crops, making those soils healthy so that it could capture the carbon emissions naturally, which has a huge potential because imagine so much of land people use for farming. And if farmers are sensitized and if they learn how to maintain healthy soils, then more carbon that is outside is being naturally trapped, could be trapped in the soils. So yes, there is this what was that, Star Trek
Tony
sort
Stark.
of
Yeah,
Tony Stark kind
Iron
of an
Man.
approach, which is in the making. But there is also nature-based solutions for the similar challenges, which is more potential and more promising, I would say.
For sure, because that could be replicated all over the world, whereas with these special machines, you'd have to have the resources, which I imagine they will be very expensive. Yes. So I love that there are solutions within nature, for those of us who believe in the Bible, within creation itself. If we would just look to that, study that, and then actually implement it. It's encouraging and inspiring to think that it could have a real impact.
Human beings are God's channel of love, number one. And human beings are supposed to take care of the natural world with the same compassion God has shown to them. And if you look at the Genesis story itself, when God gave the first task to Adam was to actually take care of the nature. And he also gave an assistant to actually help him do that piece of work. So the man and woman, they have a key role in being good stewards in taking care of the nature that God has given us. So that's a good stewardship. So if I were to boil down all of this climate change into just one single line, would just be this: God has called us to be good stewards, and that stewardship applies to the nature. Simple as that.
Yeah, I keep thinking how, you mentioned typically the understanding of what being a good steward means is giving your tithes and giving your offerings, but we were given the command to be good stewards before there was a necessity to give tithes and offerings. Like the original understanding of good steward was take care of my creation. And I love what you said, that it's deeply rooted in God's love. And that's where our roots are as believers. And that's where our responsibility is, regardless of what the trends are, regardless of what is happening. That's beautiful. Thank you.
And how perfectly all of this fits into ADRA's mandate: love, compassion, and justice. We could apply all of that to climate change, and it perfectly fits there as good stewards.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Avish. I really enjoyed chatting with you on this. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our listeners and viewers have as well. And I invite them to come to our website to learn more about what ADRA is doing for climate change and climate action, to get excited, and to just go on this journey with us of showing God's creation His love and showing people His love as well. Thank you, Avish, again for coming and being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Heather.